Good evening, everybody. I'm back for this week's hashtag Fertility Experts Live. We had a week off last week, and we're back tonight being joined by Natalie Silverman from the Fertility Podcast. We're going to be talking about the conundrum of what to do with remaining embryos. Often a conversation not really talked about in the TTC community. So really interesting. And I'll talk a bit about mine. So just waiting for the connection, and we should be ready to go in a second. Whilst we're talking, we'd love to hear your thoughts and your experiences, your decisions, so we can talk about how hard the decision is. Good evening. Hi, Natalie.
Hi, thank you for having
How
me.
are you?
Yes, I'm good, thank you.
Good, good. I've just done a really quick introduction, but please could you introduce yourselves to those who are joining, who don't know who you are, and then we can talk a bit
Yeah.
about our topic of remaining embryos
Sure.
tonight.
Yeah, sure. Hello, I'm Natalie Silverman. I host the Fertility Podcast, which I've been doing for 6 years now after having successful fertility treatment. Our son is 5.
Yep.
And yeah, I've spent about the last 18 months dealing with the dilemma of what to do with our frozen
Mm-hmm.
embryos, and yeah, have kind of then reached the point of what we've done, and then have been sharing it, which is why we're gonna chat, which I'm really grateful for you for kind of, giving me that space to do it, because it is something that I know, and I know you know, that
Yeah.
whenever this conversation comes up, there's lots of us that are just, we're in limbo and we stress about it.
I also think that it's kind of a difficult conversation to have within the trying to conceive community, because obviously a lot of people are trying to make embryos, so to then be talking about what to do with remaining embryos is obviously hard for people to perhaps imagine or comprehend when you're so desperately trying to create them. And we all know, or we know having done IVF, what goes into making them.
Hmm.
So tell us a bit about your story, and your
Yeah.
decision, and what's been happening over the last 18 months.
Yeah, and I know it's a really tricky one, and I'm aware of that. And having been in this space now for, as I said, the 6 years, I've seen all the different ways that we share,
Mm-hmm.
um, and I think initially, kind of even talking about secondary infertility was something that was a tricky one because of where different people are at. But ultimately, my husband and I, due to circumstance mainly, had to reach the decision that we weren't going to have further treatments. Both of us have had quite varying careers. We've moved around. We haven't bought a house, which is a big, from a financial point of view, we've had
Mm-hmm.
to consider really kind of seriously about what our future is. And so it was me really that started to drive this decision, because we were paying again and again the storage fees, and I felt quite strongly that I wanted us to make a decision, either that we were going to try and have treatment, or that we were going to do something, because it started to impact me quite significantly. And where I started was that I was trying to work out if I could um, get some support in making the decision. I'm Jewish, and I can't remember what led me to Hannah, which is a Jewish organization. I don't know whether it was that I already knew about them or I sought them out. I can't quite remember, but I had a conversation with them about if I was to make this decision, and I'm Jewish, but I'm not really I'm not Orthodox. I'm not really religious in my practice, but I wanted to know that if I was going to make this decision, if there was some kind of prayer, because we weren't in a position to give our embryos to another couple, because I was 35 when we had treatment, and you have to be under 35.
Mm-hmm.
And also both of us felt quite unsure about how that would make us feel. So we started to look into this idea of donating to science, but I felt I wanted to do it with a blessing of, or a blessing of sorts. Anyway, there wasn't. But what it led was for me to have conversations with Hannah, with a counsellor, about where I was and what I was feeling. And what she then said to me was that she thought I needed implications counselling, and that was something that my clinic should offer. And that took me back to my clinic. And then I started a process of implications counselling.
So what's involved in that?
in implications counselling. Well, it's obviously counselling like you may have had experience of, you know, along the way with your fertility treatment or for other things, but it's basically helping you to understand the implications of what you're doing. So it kind of maps out what your options are, and it also helps you think about not just what you're not going to be doing, but what I found really freeing. But it helped. So as a starting point, it helped me acknowledge the grief in terms of what I was then going to go through. And any of us dealing with infertility, we've grieved for what we weren't able to do naturally, and we've grieved for what we maybe haven't been able to do with our cycles or with ongoing cycles. And that was the first time that had really been explained to me. And then we also worked on allowing myself to be in that sadness for a time, and talk through how that would be. Because obviously knowingly going into something that's going to be sad is quite obviously hard and unusual, because normally you're kind of hit with the grief and then you maybe seek help, but to kind of almost prepare yourself, obviously challenging but quite empowering, because it enabled me to be prepared. And then what we talked about was the kind of enabling of what this decision would then enable our lives to be. And so I think what it enabled us to do was to look at this decision differently. And my husband was involved with one of the sessions. I did the others on my own for a number of reasons, but mainly, you know, it was whatever he wanted to do. That was what he wanted to do. I do think it's something that if you're in a relationship, to see if you can both have it of sorts, because obviously it is a decision that involves both of you. And the process was totally done on my terms. At the end of each session, the counsellor never said, which I thought she would, you know, when we're speaking again, she just kind of left me to seek her out again. Hence the period of time. You know, it took me 18 months to reach the point of talking to people, talking here, talking on my podcast about it, and then telling my, and also during that time, because you're actually talking about a transaction with your clinic, we were getting paperwork, as you do, about the decision. And I'd made the point of not paying, and then got kind of
a massive bill,
paperwork reminder letters that were kind of, this is overdue, you haven't paid, those kind of letters. And I then, you know, contacted them and told them what was going on with this, that we were in this place of trying to make this decision. And I think if that's you, definitely tell your clinic that you're thinking of making this decision, because the paperwork is literally an automated system. And I think that I took it very personally. I was like, how dare you send me these letters? So that's definitely something to bear in mind with how the process goes.
And you mentioned your husband came to one of the sessions with you. Did he have the same kind of trauma and fear about letting go of the remaining embryos that you had, or was it an easier decision for him?
It wasn't an easy decision, but I think that he was a bit further along in where he saw our family unit as being much more practical. I think I was much more emotionally attached to them. And I was carrying a lot of guilt about our son not having a sibling. And we're both siblings, and we both have siblings. And I was just very aware. I was just talking a lot about what our son was not going to have. And he was probably more talking about what he could have, what we could give him.
Has he talked about it?
Sorry?
Has he talked about the desire to have a sibling? Has he ever mentioned it?
Yeah. He's talked about it there was a period of time where he had asked questions about being a big brother.
Okay.
And I had explained to him that he might not be a big brother. Only because of mummy being busy with work was the kind of reason that I'd given him, which was the reason,
Yeah.
was the kind of, the reality was that I work for myself, and I in a some ways selfish way, in another ways enabling way, wanted to see what we could do with my work as we were. And I know that it's not the ideal, and I know that in an ideal world it would have just happened. But yeah, I think because the reality was that financially we weren't and haven't been in a strong enough position,
Mm-hmm.
and still haven't bought a house.
Yeah.
It was a head and heart, not fair, but kind of scenario. The reality being that we could give our son everything,
Mm-hmm.
and then try and achieve all the things that we want to. And if it was different and those things had been achieved, but careers and different life events meant that hasn't happened yet.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Totally. Do you think that if you had conceived your son naturally, do you think it would have been as big a trauma to decide that you weren't going to have a second child if you were able to conceive naturally? Or do you think it was harder making that decision because it's like I'm going through at the moment, it's like a final, once they're gone, they're gone. It's much more of a full stop than just saying, right, we're just going to use contraception from now on, or I'm approaching the age that I wouldn't have children anymore. So it feels like much more of a hard stop, doesn't it?
Yeah. And it's a really good question, and it's kind of a one I don't know, because it's such a, it just because it hasn't I don't know. And there's my best friend was like, what if you get pregnant naturally? You just cope with it, wouldn't you? And you just make things work. And I was like, yes, but we're kind of making that decision. I think it would have felt very different if it wasn't the case. And in terms of the full stop, what I would say is that having made the decision and put that full stop in place, I do feel a weight has been lifted.
Do you? Because I'm not there yet, and I'd love to be in that. I'd love to. So just to quickly tell you where I'm at.
Yeah.
I do have 3 children, so it sounds crazy that I would even consider what to do with a remaining embryo. But there's one remaining embryo, and I feel like this embryo is left in isolation. And I wonder what would have happened if that embryo had been transferred versus the other embryos. And it's really weird to kind of feel like I've left that one back in New York. My husband doesn't feel the same way. And that's probably also because he's not genetically related to the embryo, maybe. But we made a decision when our twins were born nearly 2 years ago that because of the expense of keeping them, we would not keep them anymore. And at that point, we hadn't decided what we were going to do with them, but we knew that we couldn't. We knew we needed to spend our money on the children that we have, rather than on the storage for a child that we may never have. And so we got the form notarized and had to send all the paperwork back to New York. And then I suddenly had a freak out, and I just felt like it was too early to send it off. And I don't know why, but a couple of months later, maybe 6 months later, I emailed them and I said, I know this sounds really crazy, but have you, like, what has happened to the embryo? And they said, oh, we'll just go and check. And then when I saw the email come through to tell me what was going on with it, my heart was racing and my hands were sweaty. And they said, just to confirm, we still have the embryo. So I don't know whether they hold it for a little bit of time in case people change their mind. But it's still there because we haven't redone the paperwork. That paperwork's been discarded. So I'm now back in that headspace from before where it's kind of like, we've wrapped up this bill. When do we decide enough is enough?
So let's talk about paperwork for a sec, because the paperwork from my clinic was lengthy in that there was various phases. So you had one exchange of paperwork. Is that what you mean?
I think so, but we had to go and get a solicitor to notarize our signatures to say what we wanted to do. But there were quite a few sheets we had to fill out. I can't remember whether we actually had, because it was so long ago now, can't remember whether
Sure.
it was tick boxes or whether I remember having to repeat what we wanted to do,
Right.
to kind of reinforce our decision.
Because what I mean is, I mean, and I'm sure every clinic is different, but there's going to be some similarity. What our experience was, we got the first round of paperwork where we said we were considering donating to science. We got a round of paperwork for us to consent to it, which I also held on to for a good while.
Just in a drawer.
Then, well, I think, yeah, I don't think we'd even signed it, either of it. Then I, like, we need to do something after I think the counselling had started. Then we sent that back, and then we got a second round of paperwork, which then detailed what happened to your embryos once you donated them to science. And this is something which is why I then went back to my clinic, which is Bourne Hall, and asked if we could make more content about this, because I felt that this was something that was totally kind of mysterious in terms of, you know, what is embryo donation actually for? Because this document was very scientific and it was quite overwhelming. The language on it was words like destroy and discard, and that had another quite triggering effect on me, and then was left for a good while with more counselling. And then once that paperwork was signed, I think there might be one more, that might be the end. So there are various stages of the consent. It's like, are you sure? Are you really sure? Are you really sure?
Yeah. There's no going back kind of thing.
Yeah. And that final piece, which is, I know I've shared the blog with you, that final piece of paperwork, even once we signed it, I didn't post it for time, because it is so finite. But one thing that I hold really dearly out of this is that we when I went to Bourne Hall and talked to their director of science, he talked about what a gift donating your embryos to science is, because it's such, in his words, a precious material. So if this is where you're at in terms of what you're thinking of doing, the donation to science, the biggest kind of, one of the biggest parts of research is all about implantation failure, and obviously it's one of the biggest reasons IVF and ICSI fails, and it's one of the hardest things for it to kind of be understood, because of the need for there to be embryos to be used in research. And I think having that kind of language given to us, you know, this is such a gift and it's so precious, and what you should be so proud of what you've done, was also quite uplifting. So I don't know if that's what you're, but one thing I was going to say that you just said before, when I talked to my mum about the decision, and she kind of went, I said, what I found very hard was knowing that, because we had 3 embryos in storage, and I found it very hard to imagine that, you know, our son's twin would, you know, was ultimately what we could have had. And my mum was saying, well, you know, that if you had another one, it wouldn't be the same. And I was like, no, it was created in exactly the same time. It literally would be, it could be a carbon copy. Because obviously, you know, if you're going by nature, or it's a later point in time, you know, there isn't that. But when it's the frozen embryo, it's literally their twin. And I found that, knowing when you can see what you've got, I found that a very hard thing to overcome. And when I kind of explained it to my mum, I remember her being like, oh yeah, it could be another him. And, you know, because he's...
I think also, and everyone is obviously entitled to their own opinion, and depending on everyone's different scenario, there'll be different views about it. Lots of people might say donate to another family, and you've just explained that the eggs were taken at an age where you're not able to do that. Mine were. And I don't know how I feel about that, because, and I'm being totally honest, because I want to give back, because our children were created through sperm donation. But I'm also conscious that our children have already got kind of a complicated layer to the situation that we're trying to navigate. So the idea of complicating that further scares me. Does that make sense?
Totally. And I know that you are also sitting in this place where you feel that you need to do something, and that
people struggling, you want to help.
But that can't really be rushed, is the one bit of advice that, you know, it kind of ebbs and flows, this feeling of wanting to do, and I mean, you do plenty, don't get me wrong, with you know, with all the work, the amazing work that you do, but I mean with this particular, with that embryo,
Yeah.
It ebbs and flows in that you kind of, you know, let yourself not think about it. But I just felt quite strongly about talking about reaching this decision, because I know so many people are sitting in this and so many people are hiding from this decision. And it's like that when you're going to sleep at night or you wake up in the middle of the night type worry or concern or decision or just weight on your shoulders.
Do you think it would be easier if you knew that it was just free storage forever?
I don't know, because, you know, we could have paid the money. It wasn't the money, it was more the principle.
Yeah,
I
making a
found
decision. Yeah.
I found that I needed to know, you know, I'm 42 and I needed to know, because also during the counselling we talked about a natural cycle, because I hadn't realised that that was an option, that we could just, you know, use the embryo and see the embryos and see. And I just then was like, well, that almost takes me back. I've got to this place where I'm thinking, okay, I'm looking at what life is going to be. And if I go down that route, then I might as well just go, you know, we might as well just have treatment, because the counsellor was saying to me, you know, if it's not meant to be, it's not meant to be. And I was thinking, that feels irresponsible, because we've got all these reasons, you know, as to our choice.
Mm-hmm. And I think also,
but I think
the other thing, which we haven't really talked about yet, and which is something someone said to me, and I've got one left, you had 3. So it's a bit different. But if those 3, if you decided, okay, you were going to go for a sibling, and you tried to use those 3 and none of them worked,
I know.
you then got into a headspace where you really had set your mind on having a second child. So,
and I was very nervous about that as well.
Yeah.
Because when I had my fertility treatments 6 years ago, I had my best friend that had been through treatment, and this community wasn't like it was. I mean, obviously there were forums, but the Instagram community wasn't like it was. And she said to me, you know, don't look online, don't look at anything negative. And she was brilliant, and she was sending me all meditations, and you know, I was fortunate first time. And I'm not saying that, you know, my positive mindset made it happen, but I went into this process quite naively. We, you know, had our treatment, we had funding, we had everything, seemed quite seamless, even though obviously there was the stress of having to have fertility treatment. But I now know from the work I've done with the podcast and this community, the lengths that people go through, and the heartache and the loss, and the idea of treatment again, and the potential loss, and obviously being older, just I like you say, mentally. And this was enough of an emotional decision. I didn't feel that I wanted to do that. And I think that's something that I see people talk about. And I think we should talk about it, because ultimately this is your decision, and our mental health is so impacted, which is, you know, why I'm doing the work I'm doing now to support people better. It's amazing. So impactful that you've got to really think it through when it comes to further treatment, and only you know what you want to do.
I think also what I found when I was going through treatment for the second time after my first was born, and I published a story about secondary infertility today, a friend spoke about her personal experience. I feel like the time and the stress going through that treatment the second time was almost harder than the first time, because, which sounds crazy, but because I felt like I was not potentially giving my daughter what she needed during that time, because it was such a stressful time, and I didn't want those repercussions to have an effect on her emotions. I mean, she was a small baby at the time, but if that treatment had continued to go on for a long time, I would hate to think of the people who are going through that and they feel like they might be missing out on their firstborn, special time with their firstborn, and the stresses that come with that, and not being able to enjoy family life because of continuous treatment.
Yeah. And I think part of that, part of the pressure, there's an element, obviously, that we put guilt on ourselves, but also there's the pressure that we put on ourselves to have more than one child, because of the whole only child conversation, and it's something that I've also, talked about, is that I don't want to talk about him as an only child or just having one child. And it's, I try to correct people when people say, have you just got one child? And I say, yes, my one and only, or, the sound bites that I have, there's no just in my child. And it's part of the conversation, actually, that I've been working with Ferring. They've got this brilliant Fertility Orcs campaign, and it's part of the conversation that I've been having in when I talked about some of the experiences that I've had.
Do
And I
people
think
actually say that to you? You've only got one
about
child?
having only, yes, a lot. And especially when my son started school and I was going to, you start to meet other parents, and everybody says, do you just have one child, or have you only got the one? And you're just like, yes, I have one child. Not that I don't only have one child. I have one child.
Yeah.
And I feel very strongly about that narrative.
Yeah. So true. So true. I'd love
But
to
it's
know a
what
little
we're
bit
used to
more.
saying.
Sorry?
It's what we're used to saying. And a lot of the things that
Okay.
people get said to them on this journey, and the wrong things, are just because people it's like they pick the wrong soundbite, don't they?
I've had a lot of people say, because of the small age gap of my 3, people say, oh gosh, bet you didn't wish for that, or things like that, where you're kind of like, you smile and you're thinking, I don't know where to start. Or I'll say, well, actually, they're IVF, and then they're sort of like, oh, sorry. But going back to the conversations you had in the counselling and support from your clinic, I'd love to know more, being in that space now. What are the differences in terms of the options? So what happens when you donate embryos to science? Did they tell you more about what happens when you donate embryos to someone else?
Well, we mainly focused in the conversation I had with them about donating to science. So I am not in a place to explain how donating to another couple goes, but implication counselling is still what you would need. And obviously there's consent, and there's screening and aspects like that. Obviously, if you've got frozen embryos that have been screened prior, then that's a given. But if you haven't, then that's something. And then I suppose there's the whole issue of the thaw, and I don't really know enough about that. We in the video, so Bourne Hall have made a video, and I'll be sharing more videos. They made a kind of fuller version of the video, which I've then shared as this week's podcast, talking a bit more about the embryo research, and the main emphasis. There's always different research going on, and I think there's 4 main groups in the UK focus, but there's embryo research going on around the world. And this week it's ESHRE. There's going to be all sorts of conversations coming out about more discoveries from embryo research, but ultimately it's things like the reasons for implantation failure, and it will be kind of the reason that well, it's ultimately, sorry, I don't want to, I don't feel educated enough about the actual process within the lab, but it's ultimately about what we talked about was ultimately about the implantation failure. So do have a listen to the better explanation than I've just given of what I've put in the podcast.
Okay. So where can people go to find that?
Well, the fertilitypodcast.com is the website. The Fertility Podcast is on all the podcast apps, and it's the one that we've just released this week.
Great.
Like I said, I've got more videos that we actually made together, talking with my counsellor, who I got to, because I'd done all the sessions on Skype, and I think obviously with where we are in the world right now, don't feel that you can't access this kind of support, because it can obviously all be done virtually. And it's actually kind of nicer being on your couch rather than the stress of driving to an appointment and the unknown of where you might be going, and that can add all sorts of stress. But definitely get the support.
Or even if it was at your clinic, going back to your clinic like you just done for the videoing, it's weird, isn't it? Because I went back to interview my specialist in December, and sitting in that waiting room was the oddest experience.
So you went back to New York?
In December when I interviewed my specialist.
How did you feel?
It felt surreal. I mean, it was a weird time of day where there were no patients in the waiting room, but I was just looking around the waiting room, kind of like remembering the feelings and the anxieties from being there. remembering the waiting room being packed and no one looking at each other.
Yes.
That kind of feeling. It just put me on edge, and it just felt
Yeah.
clinical and weird.
Yeah. I mean, I felt, because I actually went to my clinic the day after my son turned 5. And in this podcast that I've shared, I actually shared a bit of me the day before because I was prepping and I got really upset, and I recorded myself rather than kind of popping on here. That's for me is much safer place to kind of, and that's why I make a podcast, because I'm much kind of happier there. And I was quite surprised that I was still emotional about it and was thinking, oh God, maybe this is a stupid idea. I'm kind of, putting myself in this very triggering place. But like I said at the start, part of this process is understanding that you will feel sad, and listening back to myself feeling sad. I got sad.
Mm-hmm.
And even thinking about coming to talk to you about it tonight, I felt sad. But we're getting a kitten at the weekend.
Oh, amazing.
So that's going to be our new family member. And my son hasn't talked about being a big brother for a while. I mean, every now and again, he more talks about being a daddy than being a big brother now. But I think, we're getting this kitten, and that's going to be our fur baby. And
you're going to let him name it?
He named her before she'd arrived. Yeah. The name came before the kitten. Yes, she's called Lola. We've just had a video update of her this evening. But yeah, I think just knowing that the sadness catches you and continues to catch you. I'm sure you feel it. At various stages, it is a annoying kind of add-on of having infertility in your life, that it kind of sits there in the background. Sadness.
You mentioned comments from friends. Have you had people giving their opinions, like family and friends, about what they think you should do?
My family have been very diplomatic about it. My friends have been very open and honest, because I was very nervous about how I've got friends who are only children, so I've talked with them about it, and I've had pros and cons from them. I've also had friends who have I've talked to other friends with only children who are older, and I've talked to other friends who have several children, and everybody has, I suppose, assured me that our son, because I've always been nervous about what impact it would have on him and how he is. And everybody, and not that you need other people's assurance, but other people have said that they always think he's very sociable and personable. And I suppose that's all you can hope for when you haven't got that. I mean, lockdown, when it started, I was like, oh my God, this is really affecting this decision in my mind, because I was seeing and hearing about other friends with their children playing, and very aware that there wasn't that. And obviously I was with the working from home side of it, but then it was lovely to see how our unit, our family unit, developed and strengthened, and having that intense time as we've all had. So yeah, I think everybody has been extremely supportive, but yeah, diplomatic, supportive. Nobody friendship wise or family wise has said, you're being selfish or what you're doing. I've had that externally. I've had, comments from stuff I've shared, people going, well, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you have more treatment? How can you do that? But that's part of putting your stuff out there, isn't it? People can say what they want.
Yeah, like going back to the decision about how to donate them, what to do with them. It's such a personal decision, and there are so many factors that come into play. So it's impossible to say that there's a one size fits all. And also, if you're in a relationship, you need to think about what the other person feels as well. So it's really tricky. And going back to your family thing, do you feel like your parents had any opinions about it because they may have been feeling the grief of not having another grandchild?
Well, I'm the youngest of 3 siblings, so my parents have lots of grandchildren.
Right, okay.
So I was fortunate in that there wasn't that kind of pressure. They were just wanting us to do what was right for us, and they know that the house situation is a big deal.
Yeah, of course.
And you know, that just unfortunately the way things have changed, because I moved around for such a long time because I used to present on the radio, and never knew where I was going to be, and met my husband probably late because we met when I was kind of into my 30s, and so I think they just want us to be happy. So there's never been the judgment or the pressure, which I know we've been fortunate, because I know that's stuff that other people in this space have to deal with, the parental and family pressure of further treatment. But it's your life, it's your body, and that's you've got to do what's right for you.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. For anyone who's watching, it would be really useful or interesting to know your thoughts about whether you're wondering what to do about remaining embryos and where you are in the process of it, I guess. And Natalie, you are moving into an amazing new space, on top of what you're already doing in the fertility community, which is incredible. Tell us a bit more about the coaching.
Well, this process has been a real eye-opener for me in the impact that all of this has on our emotions. Like I say, our treatment worked first time, so I didn't have that ongoing impact of failed treatment, but what I then have dealt with is the secondary infertility, and then this decision of whether to have treatment or not, and what that meant, and had to explore that emotionally, and had wanted to be better equipped in dealing with my emotions, and had wanted to find a way that I could also help the community I was working in. And you'll know that you have a real duty of care when you're sharing content around this, that you want to be able to make sure people either are signposts on where to go, or they can see it in what you're sharing.
Yeah.
And that's part of what the podcast is about. I've always spoken to fertility experts as well as men and women sharing their stories, because I wanted to give that. But then when I was being asked questions that I didn't feel I could answer, I wanted to get better at answering them. So I've basically trained to become freedom fertility specialist, which is a formula that's been created by a lady called Danny Griffiths, and it's very much looking at your emotional well-being, and it's a more subconscious level to ultimately ensure that you are in a more balanced state with your emotions, so whatever the outcome, you can deal with the day-to-day, and that you're not putting your life on hold, you are living in the wait, and it's all about understanding ways to understand your emotions. And it's got a mixture of visualizations as well as coping strategies, and it's a mixture of counseling and coaching. It's a kind of unique formula, and I feel really impactful, and something that I thought I could get my head around and then help others with, because I've never been a teacher, that whole, and I've also hidden behind this for the last year, because also I wanted to be in a emotionally stronger place myself. And we only posted the letter at the start of this year.
Yeah, it's not long.
It is definitely something that has helped me understand the importance of looking after our mental health with this, and the importance of being able to come out of the negative state to a more neutral state, not just getting happy and being fine, which is often what we're told, is to just, you'll get over it, you'll be okay. It's almost too much of a leap to come from down to up. We just need to come down to just being neutral, to be able to breathe again, to then work on feeling better. And that's something that I had been doing with my own emotions.
Absolutely. And like you were just saying, well, when I first had IVF, we basically ran into it, and it was male factor, so I just assumed it would work first time. So when it didn't, I'd had no support at all. My husband didn't want any support. I think we had one counselling session where I sobbed and used up a box of tissues, and we got out, and my husband said, never again, that's not for me.
I had a similar experience.
And so when it failed, it was kind of like smack in the face. Was not expecting that, or to feel the way I feel now, which made me even more nervous about doing it again. Not because of the fear of it taking a while to happen, or not knowing whether it was going to happen, but also the fear of feeling how I had felt when that had just happened. So that's why I feel like the support that you're giving people is so important at whatever stage you're at for coping.
I think exactly that, like the knowing that this outcome could happen. And I think having the confidence to say, okay, if that is the outcome, I'm going to have this in my toolkit to be able to deal with it. It just feels like it could set you up so much better. And, you know, I'm new into this, but the work that I've been doing so far, it's just kind of wrapping you up. Ultimately, it's a self-care strategy that you can put in place to kind of proactively deal with this stuff, so that the reaction is almost less impactful because you've already preempted it.
Yeah.
If
Totally
you
makes
get
sense.
what I'm saying.
Totally.
But so many of us don't. We just, you know, we have this like emergency state as a result of what's gone on and that devastating news. And even during the 2-week wait, and in the time I've been in this space, you know, it's changed quite a lot in the way that clinics are behaving, but still we need more support in that period of time.
Definitely.
And, you know, people checking in with us and,
Yeah.
you know, all that kind of stuff.
I remember in the second 2-week wait, I went to see a hypnotherapist in London, and I was late for the appointment because the train had been bad, and it was absolutely pouring with rain. And I think my umbrella broke. So I was running to this appointment in the rain, and I arrived there in tears, saying to this lady, I've messed it up. It's failed now because I'm wet and because I was stressed and because I've run.
I've been
I
running.
mean, what a weird headspace to be in, that you think
Yeah.
that's going to jeopardize things. Actually, that worked. But it's just crazy how much we can beat ourselves up about stuff that is out of our control and also doesn't necessarily have an impact.
Yeah, definitely. But there is that mind-body connection is powerful. And so, you know, like you say, you had success, but it would have been so much easier for you if you'd have been able to, you know, process it and deal with it and rationalize it all better. But it's all stuff that has to be taught. You know, we're kind of often taught to quash our emotions down rather than understand what they're trying to tell us and then what we should do next.
Yeah, 100%. Sherry from You Were Made for Me, I know that she's got 2 children through embryo donation. And she's just said, you know, thanks for sharing, and donating to science or another family seems impossible, but having more is physically too much too. There isn't a good scenario or outcome, is there? Whatever decision you make is going to be hard.
And I think that's the work that has to be done. Because somebody said to me, you've got to be 100% that this is the right decision. And that really played on my mind, because I felt like I couldn't get to be 100%. Like when are we ever 100? I mean, I'm maybe not brave enough to be 100%, but I was nearly there when we made the decision. And like I say, I did feel the relief after, and I do feel the relief. And, you know, talking about it with you now, I wasn't sure whether I was going to get upset. But I haven't. And I still know there'll be times that I will get sad about it. And, you know, there's still scenarios like I remember we watched something on the TV, and there was an older, you know, 2 women in their 40s talking, and they lost their mother, and they were talking about it together. And I was just thinking, oh God, you know, that broke me. I was like, he's not going to have anybody when I'm gone. You know, but like I say, I have been assured by my friends, adult friends who are only children. I've gone on against my word saying about only children. Be unique, which is the French term, which I much prefer. That they have been fine dealing with the difficulties of, you know, adult life, and that we find ways, and our family isn't necessarily blood. And, you know, we know that from being in this space, you know, families are in all shapes and sizes and colours. And
my father-in-law is an only child, and I said only then, didn't I? He doesn't have siblings, and I've said to him, how's that been growing up? I mean, how do you feel? Because he then went on to have 4 sons, and he said it hasn't affected him because it's all he's ever known.
I've had the same from other only children, saying that it's all they've ever known.
And so that's
And so I think you have to hold that dear as well, don't you?
absolutely, yeah. And someone just said, um, I made the best, this is her mantra, or his mantra. I made the best decision I could at the time with the information I had. I really like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, me
You
too.
can't look back in hindsight and think, well, what if? Because we're all human and we can only do what we can at the time.
Yeah.
Do you think it will get easier once you have hit menopause and you know that you physically couldn't have more children, in terms of trying again? Do you think that would?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. I mean, I don't really, I haven't really thought about that, but yes, because there is still that monthly reminder.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't feel month by month that, I'm not, I don't have that longing. Like I know, because I know that we've made that decision. I know that we are in a different place. It's more, I think, one of the hardest things I've found, if I'm going to be really honest, is being in this space
Mm-hmm.
and seeing people have second children
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not
or third
surprised.
children,
Yeah.
because because of no, and I don't know whether, and that's not to say that friends that have had second children hasn't affected me, but I suppose just the connection between it all in this space has been hard. But obviously, I've also been delighted for those people. Maybe it's because I've been able to voice it a bit better. And the other hard thing was the kind of the NCT group, because obviously you meet
Yeah.
this group of people at a very significant point. And, I've known my NCT lot now for 5-6 years, and there's the second and third children. And that has been a real blow because we were literally all pregnant together.
Mm-hmm.
And there's 7 of us, and each kind of couple bar 2 of us have more children. And there was a part of me that's kind of hoping that the other couple just have one child. Otherwise it will just be us that have one child, and I feel bad for thinking that, but it's a kind of self-protection thing. It's as long as it's not just us type thing, but it
Talk to them
doesn't
about it.
really matter. I never have, but and it might be something that comes up, but we live in different places now, and I could probably talk about it, and it's something that I did think about at some point, and then lockdown happened, and life happened, and I think around the time of sharing that we'd made the decision, that particular person did kind of reach out and say, I hope you're okay. And so I was very aware of, because we told our group about, our treatment further along the way. I don't think we did at the start. And I saw a chat recently on here about people talking in a kind of NCT type space about their route to parenthood. It's a funny one. It's a funny one to know how to approach
Yeah, it
different
really
conversations.
is. It really is. You've actually reminded me of something. I had this burning desire in my NCT group to like almost announce that we'd used a sperm donor. But I never did because our daughter hadn't been born then. So I didn't want to sort of make my husband feel more apprehensive than he was already feeling. But the NCT teacher used to always say things, make jokes, like we were sensitive to it, or I was sensitive to it. But I remember her often saying things that, you know, meant or suggested that everyone's child was biologically theirs. It was just a
Yeah,
given.
yeah.
And I don't know whether she would have said something different or treated us differently in any way if she'd known how our family came to be. But yeah,
I
it
think
was
we
weird
might
feeling
have
like,
some work to do, educating NCT about some of the
mm,
conversations, because I've heard different scenarios, like solo mums,
yeah,
trying to make the conversation more inclusive.
mm-hmm,
And I think there's work to be done
mm-hmm,
about the presumption of conversations in that space.
yeah, because I think
Um,
there were like jokes about making the baby and the fun that was involved in that, and the baby will take after you and the dad's in that way. And
yeah,
when you're sitting there really feeling quite nervous about what's about to happen, or you've just gone through treatment, whatever scenario it is, and you're feeling like you've been robbed of that joy of making a
And
child
you're still
naturally.
grieving from that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you're right. There should be more education around it, because, and what you just said about solo parenthood, yeah, of course, there must be a conversation to include people into that as well, so that they don't feel
Yeah,
like it's them versus couples.
exactly. Lots more work to be done,
Yeah, I
Eloise.
think that's another conversation. Oh, I'm exhausted just thinking about it. But thank you so much for your honesty tonight, and
That's a
I hope it
pleasure.
hasn't fired up anything that you didn't want to speak about. But I'm sure
Yeah.
everyone's
Do you
appreciative.
know what? It hasn't. And do you know what? I feel really proud of myself for that.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, likewise for you, you can't rush this. And I think that just being open and talking about it is really helpful. And I think you'll know when the time is right. You know,
Definitely. Yeah.
you can't rush it.
Yeah. 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 Exactly. Exactly. Oh, well, thank you so much. And we'll talk to
Pleasure.
you
Thank you for
soon.
having me.
Okay. Night.
All right. Enjoy
Thanks.
your evening.
Bye.
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 Bye.